All right, in this lecture video, what we're actually going to get into is a discussion about the sort of internal decision making that occurs amongst competitive firms in a competitive market. Up to this point, we've thought about competitive markets broadly, and we've thought about them in terms of an assumption about the aggregation of producers, right? So the supply curve that we've discussed in class up to this point has been assumed to represent all of the firms in a given market, differentiated by, of course, their position on the supply curve in terms of their willingness to accept either a high or low price. And we've kind of sort of discussed how if you're at the high end of the supply curve, then you're a high cost firm, and this means that you have a high willingness to accept, meaning that you require a higher price, and which makes sense. So higher cost firms are going to require a higher price for their product. Think about sort of organic milk versus cheaper milk, which would be from producers on the low end of the supply curve who have lower costs and therefore have lower willingness to accept. And that's really how far we've gotten with that particular discussion. So what we're going to do now is actually discuss what's going on in the market around firms that lead them to make these particular decisions. All right, so first let's bring back something that we haven't talked about for a long time, but we actually talked about it towards the beginning of class, and that was what actually motivates business decisions in our model. Our model business decisions are made exclusively because of profits, and most importantly, we say that firms are profit maximizers. So what does this mean? Well, if we look at the profit function, again, we can see that the profits are going to be equal to total revenue minus total cost. And one of the things that I always did when I was an econ student, and then even now as a professor, is I want to simplify things as much as possible for myself. I want to be able to break things down very quickly. And so when I look at this particular portion of the profit function, P times Q, this is that total revenue, right? This is the amount of money that you have coming in to your firm from the sale of your good. And so it's simply the price of your product times how much of that product you sell. And then for right now, we'll keep total cost as being the simple, just total cost function. Now, it is important, and we have discussed this previously, for us to remember that in economics, we're always thinking about both explicit as well as implicit costs. Explicit costs being, your labor, your input cost, all the things that explicitly cost you money to run your business. And then there's also all these implicit costs. So implicit costs are the opportunity cost associated with the production of whatever good you're choosing. So our assumption is that if firms are profit maximizers, they're also taking into consideration all of the other business ventures that they could be doing, and that therefore, whichever business venture they're currently doing, that's what's best for them. It's a very simple, relatively innocuous point to make, but it keeps the model rational. It keeps the model relatively straightforward. So, what we learned previously in class was that we can generally think about the profit function as we increase our quantity sold. We can think about the profit function as increasing and then decreasing, kind of a classic diminishing marginal returns. So the idea here is that the goal of business will not simply be to produce as much as possible or even to sell as much as possible, because in fact, what is going to happen is that when we're in this portion of our profit function, our revenues are rising faster than our costs, and so our profits are rising. But when we get past, in this particular model, 500 units, we can see that now my profits are falling. And this means that my costs are now rising faster than my revenues. And so oftentimes students sort of naively believe that the goal of business is simply to sell as many of your product as possible. But that's not really true at all. Firms have to take into consideration costs, and costs tend to balloon as you try to produce more and more and more of your product. Again, because of diminishing marginal returns kind of add up and pile up. And so if I just try to produce as much of my product as possible, I'm going to have very inefficient workers with a lot of inefficient capital being used. And as a result, my profit function or my business function will be highly inefficient. So really the whole point of all this discussion is to say that firms are looking for profit maximizing quantity. They're looking for that quantity that literally is the peak of their profit function. Here we can see that for this particular firm, their profit maximizing quantity was 500 units. Um, Now it's important for us, and we'll see this in just a moment, to recognize that profit maximization by choosing a particular quantity will require us to know price as well as know total cost. How else could we pick a quantity to maximize profits if we didn't know price and we didn't know our total cost? But for right now, let's just assume that there is a particular quantity for us to pick that does indeed maximize our profits. Now, when we think about cost, we're going to want to differentiate between cost in the short run and cost in the long run. Right now, we're going to live in a world purely of the short run. And what this means is that our total cost function is going to be unique. In the short run, total cost is made up of variable cost and fixed cost. Okay, again, variable cost and fixed cost. And these two costs make up our total cost function. And here we can see an explicit version, a specific version of a total cost function. So this is one I just made up, but this is pretty reminiscent of what we would assume to be a general cost function. And so variable cost is defined as those costs associated with production. So if we look at our total cost function, anywhere where there's a Q, that is to say anywhere where our total cost changes relative to a quantity, that's going to be our variable cost. So we can look at total cost function. We can see that 2Q squared minus Q plus 1,000. Well, there's no Q over here, so this has nothing to do with variable cost. And so our variable cost is simply 2Q squared minus Q. And again, the point of variable costs is that these are costs that will change with how much we decide to produce. So if we were to produce more, for the most part, variable costs will rise. And if we want to produce less, for the most part, variable costs will fall. Now, fixed costs is that unique part of the short run cost curve. So in the short run, we have unavoidable costs. These are things like leases and rentals and even contracts that, despite how much I produce, I still have to pay these things. So if I lease a factory, for example, to make a bunch of shoes, and then I decide halfway through the year that I don't want to make any more shoes, I am not able to get out of that lease. So I have to keep paying that lease for the full year, regardless of how much I produce. And so this is why we consider fixed costs to be unavoidable in the short run. And if you look at our total cost function, fixed cost is just that chunk of our total cost function that doesn't have a quantity associated with it. So here we can see that fixed costs are 1,000. You can think about fixed cost in a sense as being sort of the entry fee into a market. We'll find out later on that we need to have profits that are at least larger than our fixed costs, than sort of the negative amount of our fixed costs for us to stay in business, for us to choose to continue making products. So you can really think about these fixed costs as being kind of the hurdle that a business would have to jump over before they can even think about producing their product. And so this is ultimately why in many markets we have barriers to entry, because fixed costs can be very high. In certain industries, fixed costs become barriers to the prevention of competition because small startups are unable to come up with the fixed costs necessary to get into a particular market. Like say the computer industry, for example, can be a very expensive industry to get into. While computer components themselves are quite cheap, the actual apparatus of selling computers itself is quite difficult and carries with it a tremendous amount of fixed cost. That's kind of besides the point, and we'll get to talk about those discussions a little bit later. But for right now, let's just sort of think about fixed cost as being that chunk of our total cost function that has nothing to do with quantity. And sort of regardless of how much we produce in the short run, we will have to pay our fixed costs.